What should you do if a police officer stops you on the street? In this episode of Trailblazing Justice, co-director of the Oregon Innocence Project, Kenneth, explains why the rules for safely asserting your rights, don't trust, don't talk, don't consent, are critical for anyone who might be targeted by law enforcement. Whether you're a protester, an immigrant, or just want to avoid getting caught in the system, this conversation breaks down essential survival skills for encounters with the police. And it's all coming up on Trailblazing Justice. It's time for Trailblazing Justice, the weekly podcast where we discuss civil and criminal rights in Oregon and beyond. Trailblazing Justice is a production of the Oregon Justice Resource Center. Episode 65, recorded Thursday, May 15th, 2025. Knowing Your Rights. Here's Bobbin.
Welcome back to another episode of Trailblazing Justice. I'm Bobbin Singh, the Executive Director of the Oregon Justice Resource Center. And today I have Kenneth with me, the director or co-director of the Oregon Innocence Project. Kenneth has been with us for, I think, a couple of years now, maybe more.
About 2 or 3 years.
2 or 3 years, yeah. But Kenneth is a longtime criminal defense and civil rights attorney here in Oregon. We were very fortunate to be able to bring him on as the managing director of OIP and now the co-director of the Oregon Innocence Project. But Kenneth has also been heavily involved with National Lawyers Guild and doing Know Your Rights training and supporting advocates and protesters in the Portland and across the state of Oregon. But that's just a brief introduction. Kenneth, do you want to give just a little bit of background of where you came from and how you came to practice this type of law and why you're engaged in kind of the work that you're engaged in?
Sure. So I have a long history of being involved in different types of activist projects. And that's what led me to the law in a large part. Prior to going to law school, I worked as a legal worker in law collectives, which are kind of collective organizations, mostly of non-lawyers, that kind of work to provide legal support to activists or protesters in different types of movements. The big ones, because of my age, were these kind of large anti-globalization kind of protests, where frequently hundreds of people would get arrested, and so there was a large need to have legal workers providing support for the folks getting arrested or risking arrest, and then tracking their cases through, helping gather evidence, giving it to lawyers. Ultimately, that led me to law school, where I focused on criminal defense and civil rights work, and that's what I've done ever since. So I've been a lawyer since 2006 or so. I graduated from Lewis and Clark, and I've continued to provide legal support to folks in activist communities over the years through all of my various jobs. As a lawyer, I've worked as a public defender. I've worked as a solo practitioner, worked as a member of a now defunct kind of progressive law firm called the Portland Law Collective, where we did civil rights, criminal defense, labor law. And it's been a pleasure to work with OJRC project, the Oregon Innocence Project, 2022.
Nice. And then one of the things that I've known you for, at least in large part, is your involvement in engagement with the National Lawyers Guild. We haven't really talked about the Guild here, but you always hear this comment, I'm a Guild attorney, I support the Guild, I'm part of the National Lawyers Guild. National Lawyers Guild, of course, are, I think, kind of well known because of their role as legal observers at protests. But do you want to just provide us a little overview of the National Lawyers Guild and why you're involved with it?
Sure. So the National Lawyers Guild has been a organization in the United States for the last 90 years or so. It started in, I think, 1934, and it was a national bar association originally of only lawyers. It was the first integrated bar that had white and non-white lawyers as members of it, as kind of an alternative to the ABA back in the day, which was not integrated. Other various bars around. It expanded and grew to include law students and jailhouse lawyers and legal workers. And essentially what it is, it's a network of lawyers with progressive left values. It's a large tent on that side of the political spectrum. And the thing that drew me to it is a lot of the various struggles that I found to be very important and very formative and very inspirational, kind of people struggles that I knew about in North America, um, you know, in the last 100 years or so, whether that be labor struggles or, from everything kind of more traditional labor struggles to like farm workers, to political cases where the federal government has targeted folks based on their politics, to um, you know, so large civil rights cases, challenging police overbreath, police use of force. When you really drill down and you look at those lawyers, a lot of those lawyers were all members of the National Lawyers Guild. And so a lot of the projects um, and a lot of the different efforts that I found to be really inspirational, a way to get involved in a way that the lawyers were all working together was through the National Lawyers Guild. Um, so as a law student, it was an important way for me to make contacts and connections with folks. And it has provided a lot of support for folks on the streets and in people's movements in the United States. Um, and so the NLG was a home, as the kind of the activist legal collectives I was describing before I went to law school was a home in a way for those activist legal collectives to be connected with lawyers on a large scale. The NLG was super supportive of the law collective movement, and it was a natural fit for me. One of the things that they do that I think is, which I'm here today, is they've been known as a place where different groups that have adversarial relationships with the police, that is where the police are, targeting them as adversaries, um, had contacted the guild over the years to ask for know your rights training, kind of street law trainings, to give folks information and skills and practice and exercising their rights in a way that's protective of them. And so I did that before law school, and I did that in law school, and I've done that as a lawyer, as doing know your rights trainings. And I've done know your rights trainings for all sorts of groups. I've done know your rights trainings for different activist groups that are risking arrest. I've done know your rights trainings for Black and Hispanic youth, kind of at-risk youth, gang at-risk youth. I've done them for folks in the Dreamer community, the DACA community. I've done know your rights trainings for folks in other immigrant communities, largely kind of older white kind of peace and justice activists, younger subcultural, anarcho-punk folks who are being targeted by the police, all sorts of folks who fear that the police could be after them and they could be targeted by them. These know your rights trainings have been really useful.
Yeah, it's so, if anyone's listening and or any of our listeners are interested in hosting a Know Your Rights training, feel free to reach out. And we'll put Kenneth's contact information in the show notes so people can contact him directly. But, just going back to the National Lawyers Guild, it's been real interesting. Going when I was going through law school, I'd have this like push and pull because I was very involved with the ACLU, and believe very much in what the ACLU stood for and stands for. But there were these moments where the ACLU would take a very principled legal stance, but it didn't make sense from like a political values-based stance because the ACLU is committed to uh, uh, a certain way of interpreting the Bill of Rights. But there's sometimes like I think the biggest example that the ACLU always gets hammered with is like representing neo-Nazis on free speech things. And then this is where the guild would, be different and say, no, we're not going to do that, just because from a value standpoint, the intersection between what those people stand for and the oppression and sort of the asymmetric power of the law and how it's being used are all intertwined. And so it was always this push and pull for me of like trying to go in between the two. But I always appreciated the guild because of not only was it a legal organization, but it was also very values based. And I think small p political in the sense that it didn't seem like it was endorsing any political candidates, but they stood for a political perspective, which I thought was which I think is, at this moment actually very critical to have people who take positions. So and people can get involved with the guild, right? Law students and things like that. They just have to go online.
Yeah, NLG.org, national website. There's a lot of different local chapters, different kind of policy boards or different projects of the Guild. If you're interested in immigration law or international law, like international human rights law, if you're interested in protest defense, there's all of these different kind of topical working groups that are working on different projects. For example, when I was in law school, I was in law school from 2003 to 2006. It was, relatively soon after 9/11. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were ongoing. And at that point in time, military recruitment was difficult. And so there was a big push by the Bush administration at that time to increase and to retain folks in the military. And so one of the things that we did in law school at Lewis and Clark through the Guild is we started a GI rights hotline where, there's all these GI rights hotlines nationally. We started one that was part of that network where when folks would call into the National GI Rights Hotline from Oregon, they would get routed to our number. And then as law students, supervised by lawyers and by the military law task force of the Guild, we would help people assert their rights in the military, frequently getting out of the military or standing up for their rights. Um, and as a way of trying to support service members and getting out of the military and making sure that they were being treated correctly and weren't being asked to do anything unlawful. This was a big issue in Iraq, with like Abu Ghraib and whatnot, that providing support for our service members is really important. That's just one opportunity that the Guild allowed, us as law students. And then we actually filed a lawsuit that went up to the Ninth Circuit challenging what was called the stop loss program, where the Bush administration wasn't letting folks get out of the military and they normally would, but was invoking what they call stop loss to keep them in. That gave me an opportunity. Also through, I think, my Guild connections, I was able to work with Center for Constitutional Rights, where I got to work on a bunch of, post 9/11 torture and kind of rendition cases, including Aurora Harris case, and was working on the early Gitmo cases, Guantanamo Bay cases. Being part of the Guild has been a great opportunity. And certainly if you're in law school or you're a legal worker and, you're interested in, all the different struggles that are going on, I bet if you drill deep enough, you'll find a Guild attorney at the bottom of that. And that could even be true if you look at ACLU cases. A lot of the members and folks, staff attorneys with ACLU have been members of the Guild. The Guild, in many ways, is a broader tent than the ACLU, I think, although that could be a point of contention. But you'll get folks who are more kind of establishment liberal minded in the Guild. You'll get folks who are, believe in the necessity of some sort of social revolution in the Guild. You'll get folks, who really focus on international human rights. Everything kind of from start to finish. The Guild's been a great political home for me, and
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, well, I'm appreciative of the rich history of the Guild and all the people who've been involved in it, and the support and advocacy and defense of activists, protesters, advocates, political prisoners, whatever it may be, throughout its history. So, but yeah, know your rights is a big part of of a lot of legal organizations or a lot of legal groups, including like the ACLU and the Guild, like you mentioned, and know your rights training. We just did one recently for our office that you headed up. So I figured it would be nice if we did something more public where you could share that information to the people who support the organization for the Oregon community. So I know people, there's a general anxiety right now. I think we're witnessing and seeing on a daily basis various types of law enforcement agencies engaging in what I would say illegal practices, detaining people, picking people off at the streets. And we'll maybe start off with, just as a know your rights sort of overview, just setting the sort of the framework for this conversation. When we're talking about law enforcement, there's such a wide variety as we're seeing, like whether it's ICE, FBI, state law enforcement. When you're talking about like know your rights for this, what are we talking about? What law enforcement agencies? And is it important for us to know, are there different rights associated with different types of law enforcement agencies?
So the information that's given, that at least I give in Know Your Rights trainings, are based on fundamental human rights that are enshrined in the federal constitution and the state constitution. So they apply no matter who you're talking to, no matter who's targeting you, no matter what sort of law enforcement. They apply no matter whether it's federal law enforcement, state law enforcement, local city, kind of municipal law enforcement. Doesn't matter if it's the ATF or the DEA or ICE. Like when it comes down to it, all of this, all of the kind of KYR, the Know Your Rights advice that's given is really anchored into universal human rights that are enshrined in our Constitution. And so it doesn't matter. With that said, the Know Your Rights trainings that I do are really focused on criminal prosecution, and there can be other different sort of situations, other sort of consequences that aren't criminal prosecution, right? You get employment consequences. You could have immigration consequences that aren't technically criminal. So there's some situations there could be some other advice given to be followed. And so that's why, like for example, in this age of kind of heightened immigration enforcement, where ICE is now going into hospitals and places of worship and whatnot, areas that they always could go into, but they just chose not to prior to the Trump administration. One group of folks that has asked me to do, I've done maybe 3 or 4 Know Your Rights trainings in the last few months, been for nurses, many of whom work in hospitals. So their question is like, what do we do to protect ourselves and protect our patients when ICE comes into the hospital? And then, part of protecting themselves, on one level, there's a question of protecting themselves from potential criminal prosecution, right? Because the federal government has targeted folks for charges of harboring or whatnot, criminal charges for protecting folks in the immigrant community. But then there's also a question that folks want to know about employment consequences. And so, if you're worried about employment consequences, the advice that I would give you may be different. And quite frankly, what I would normally do is wouldn't give you that advice because, there's different jurisdictions, different sort of employment circumstances. And so, for some consequences, such as employment consequences, if you work in a unionized workplace, it's best to talk to your union about it and to kind of come up with some sort of unified idea. But then also know that if you're worried about criminal consequences, if you do give them information because you're required to your employment, that could turn into criminal charges. So there's always this question of what sort of advice is best in what sort of situation. Like for example, if you're working in a school and this isn't a political example, but these are this is a very real example that happens all the time. And there's student allegations of sexual contact or sexual misconduct. What you may want to do from an employment standpoint to keep your job is very different than what you'd want to do to avoid criminal charges. So even though the advice I give is mostly focused on criminal charges, and there could be different choices you'd want to make with regards to employment decisions or even immigration. So, if you're part of the immigrant community, I would really recommend that you seek an immigration specific Know Your Rights training. And then if you're, worried about cops in your workplace, take what I'm saying in mind for criminal consequences. But you'll probably want to talk around and talk, especially if you're unionized, talk to your union. If you're not unionized, it'd be best to speak to other employees and try to come up with an idea of what you should do for employment. But as I've been a criminal defense lawyer for a little bit under 20 years now, and sometimes I analogize my role as the role of like an emergency room doctor, where I'm trying to keep people out of prison, out of jail, off probation, unconvicted. And, as for their employment consequences or otherwise, my main concern is keeping people out of prison.
And
Um,
so, yeah, I mean, and thanks for that overview. But I also wanted to just quickly ask you before we jump into everything. Like I was looking at the National Lawyers Guild articulation of this, and they talk about it as know your risks as opposed to know your rights. Can you just kind of speak to that distinction and why maybe it's more accurate to say know your risk? I mean, to the point that you're just saying like you're just trying to keep people out of prison and jails by understanding the risks associated by being out there or law enforcement contact.
right. Well, I think there's a number of different reasons for that changes in terminology. In part, um, the guild is focused on providing legal support for folks who sometimes are putting themselves in situations where they could be targeted by the police,
Hmm.
the state. And, you know, a lot of folks as part of the guild, a lot of folks on the think that the way that progress is made in society is by pushing the struggle forward, and that's inherently risky. And so, they want folks, they don't want, the safest thing to do would be to not go to a protest or not be part of a people's movement that was challenging and, kind of demanding change from the powerful. Um, but, so it's impossible, the safest thing to do would not be engaged. But of course, folks want people to continue to be engaged in people's struggles to make the world better. And so that's going to be inherently risky. And so, what we do oftentimes is try to give people tools to assist them in their activism, assist them in their efforts in the world to make things better in a way that manages the risk and that can kind of help them stay on the street or stay, part of their local projects or collectives or whatever it is, mechanism that they're using to try to manifest their values in this world. So yeah, it will always be a little bit risky. Um, so that's true in one ways. And then also, the law is a vibrant living thing. And, things change all the time. And so on some level, things can always be a little bit risky. Also, there's so many exceptions that, frequently some folks when doing know your rights trainings, they give people lots and lots of information, specific information that is kind of packing, specific rules and information that's kind of reminiscent of like your first year in law school. I don't tend to do that. What I tend to do is give people some basic guidelines that I think will make them generally safer if they're being targeted by the police, um, and give them some kind of principles they can use to try to reason out what they should do in other situations. And so things are always going to be a little bit risky, but they're the advice is based on these kind of what I would think be inalienable, unchangeable, fundamental human rights. Yeah, I think that's probably why people talk about that with know your risks. It's similar to the change in terminology between like this school is a safe place or this office is a safe place to this office or school is a safer place. That's this idea acknowledging that we can't, we don't have magic wands. We can't wave wands over and make things inherently safe or unrisky.
All right. Well, I think we've thanks. I mean, like we've done like a pretty good, I think, setup now. And I think it's really helpful to have this like context and background and understanding, know your rights or know your risks. But, again, if people are interested in getting involved with the National Lawyers Guild, just before we jump into this, just look into the National Lawyers Guild up online. And there's a lot of opportunities, especially for like law students, if you're at a law school. This is a really great place to start getting your feet wet and getting some experience and also getting connected to people in the community that are doing this work. So a good place to start. So Kenneth, what do I do? I'm walking down the street and, law enforcement officer comes up to me and it starts talking to me. Should we start there or do you have another place you want to start from?
No, I think that's a good place to start. So, I mean, from a criminal defense perspective, from an activist legal perspective, the question of what you do, I mean, there's different contexts, right? There, right. So, if you're if someone comes up and starts talking to you and you don't have reason or you don't think that they're like out to get you, right? That they're wanting to talk to you, that's very different than if you're in a situation or you're just living your life in a way that you think they're always out to get you, right? Um, so, for example, you know, and that context is going to be very, very different. It's going to be based on people's street smarts and their own life experience, um, and it's going to be completely different from person to person. I generally don't give people street smart advice because what's street smart for me is going to be very different than what's street smart for somebody else. For those folks that can't see me, I'm a middle-aged balding white guy. I what's street smart for me is going to be very different than if I was a 19-year-old black man in an inner city, or if I was or it'd be also very, very different if I was, like a person that people would see and think like, oh, person's probably been living on the streets.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm not, I don't want to give people street smart advice because it's going to be very, very different. Um, um, and, you know, it's really kind of what you do in that situation is really dependent on kind of the context and what you decide to do, like on a broad sense. So, what I generally tell people, is the first rule for keeping themselves safe. That if you have reason to think that the police are adversarial to you, that is, if the police are trying to get you, they're, potentially interested in arresting you or targeting you, they want to hassle you in any sort of way. The most important things to remember is to keep that mindset and to remember that the cops are not your friends and that they're out to get you in that way. And generally, when a police officer stops and talks to you, they're not doing so because they're just being friendly, right? They're doing so as part of their job. If you're standing on a street corner and an officer drives by and rolls down a window and says hello to you and starts talking to you, they're probably not actually interested. They're not just being neighborly. They're actually engaged in either overt or covert policing. So they're either talking to you to try to gather information about you or your friends or someone in the community, or they're just trying to make their presence be felt, right? And that the advice I give to people if they're being targeted by the police, and if you feel that way, is different than other sort of advice. So, for example, if I'm just walking down the street and I'm walking by a cop and I have no reason to think that they're targeting me, like for example, it's not the middle of the night, maybe it's downtown, they're just like standing there drinking coffee, we make eye contact. That's very different than if I'm at a protest or if it's at night and the cop drives up to me or pulls me over, or something to that effect. And then, I think that for other people who are just, who are living their life where they're like, I'm always getting hassled by the cops because of the clothes I wear or the color of my skin or because of the area that I'm at or whatever, that they're always going to feel targeted. And so, rule number one really is don't trust the police. That's the rule number one, kind of like the most important thing to think about in any sort of know your rights situation, or if you think the police are out to get you, is don't trust them. The whole myth of officer friendly is just a myth. It's not truly there. And that most police officers, if they're working their job, and if you're the sort of person that they have nothing else to do, they may think, oh, let me go make my policing presence be known by engaging with that person, or I want to talk to that person because I want to target them or their friends or family members. They're not your friend. So rule number one is to remember that. So what you have to think about is you have to think like, can I trust what they're saying to me? Like the police have to be honest. A lot of people in our society think that it's actually unlawful for the police to be dishonest, to use tricks or use outright lies. And so the sad truth of the matter is that police do not have to be honest by law. There have been gallons of ink spilled by judges and law books and in case law over the decades where the judges have said again and again that it's not unlawful, that it is lawful for the police to lie to suspects, to use tricks and stratagems in almost most situations, to perform their job. And so, um, maintaining that mindset and that general knowledge is an important step in any sort of community rights situation, where you have to remember that police do not have to be honest to you. So a cop can roll up to you and can say, "Hey, you're not in trouble. Um, I'm trying to find somebody that you may know, um, and then show you a picture of someone and say, do you know this person?" The mere fact that they said you're not in trouble, that they've tried to tell you that they're looking for other people, they're not actually targeting you, that could be true, but there's no reason that has to be true. Police lawfully do not have to tell you the truth. Um, in fact, I worked on a case that's out of Portland, Oregon. And I can talk about this case. Normally lawyers can't talk about cases unless they have consent from their clients. My client has consented for me to talk about this case, and I've done so many times. I represented a, a fellow by the name of Trey Arrow, who was being targeted as a member of the Earth Liberation Front, and the police were investigating some arsons that had happened at arsons that had happened at a logging company outside of Portland, Oregon, near Estacada. And one of the ways that they were trying to build a case against Trey, saying that he was part of that, is they got information from a snitch and about other people that would have information about Trey. And so what they did is they walked up to those people on the street, showed those people, stopped and said, "Hey, I just have some questions for you. You're not in trouble." Showed them some pictures of other folks and asked them if they knew those people. And the people they stopped on the street denied knowing them, as the cops lied to them. And in doing so, the cops hadn't done anything wrong in a legal sense. The cops were not required to tell them the truth. Really what was happening was the FBI agents that were investigating the case were targeting every person they talked to, and they were trying to get them to incriminate themselves by asking them questions they already knew the answer to, by trying to get them to tell them lies, and later they used that sort of leverage against people to get them all to snitch on Trey and other people, and a bunch of people went to prison or placed in probation for years because of that. But my main point here, if you remember, is that police are not required to tell you the truth, and they're allowed to lie and to trick you. So another example that happened, real life example, some folks from the activist community who had been part of forest defense campaigns, part of some tree sits on the coast, they came out of the woods to the beach out in Lincoln City, and they wanted to have a fire on the beach, like people do, which is totally legal in Oregon. And they were sitting around a campfire on the beach, kind of just having a good time. In the evening, some police officers came up who had known that they had been part of activist campaigns, wanted to target them, and kind of started trying to ask them questions about the activist community. Folks didn't trust them like they should have. They kept the right mindset where they said, "I'm not going to trust the police. I'm not going to believe what they're telling me is honest." And they said, "We're not going to talk to you about any of that sort of information." The cops said, "That's fine," walked away. And then one of the detectives stopped and said, "Hey, I get it. You don't have to talk to us. My question is, like, the wood that you're burning, like, it's not driftwood. It looks like it's like not driftwood. Where's like, where did you find that? Was that here on the beach? I'm always looking for wood, to have fires with my family." And people were kind of lost, some folks on the beach lost their mindset about not trusting the cops. And they said, "Oh, these are pallets that we got from behind Safeway." And folks had taken some wooden pallets that, had probably been destroyed or be thrown away or whatnot behind Safeway, and they taken out to the beach to burn. And those people were immediately arrested for misdemeanor theft for stealing stuff behind Safeway. And the reason that happened is because they kind of lost their mindset with not trusting the cops. Even though they originally used it, the cops were asking them questions, were pretending that they weren't actually targeting the folks, that they're going to respect their right not to talk to them, and then kind of immediately pivoted to a trick. So rule number one, if you're walking down the street, and I just want to acknowledge I am responding to your hypothetical,
Yeah.
and you think the cops are after you. Rule number one is to maintain the right mindset. So don't trust the police. So if you think the cops are out to get you, you could not just be being paranoid. They really could be out to get you, or they could not you. They could be out to get to your friends or family member. Is to remember not to trust the police. They can lie to you and they can trick you. Um, um, and we know that's true from folks who are undercover, who break the laws with the kind of immunity agreements for a district attorney, where the district attorney prosecutor isn't going to prosecute them, or the cops aren't going to arrest them for breaking minor laws, or sometimes they're even given official immunity by a judge. Just because someone has broken the law doesn't mean that they're not working with the police. Just because just because a cop's telling you something doesn't mean that they're telling the truth. So the first thing to do, keep yourself safe, is to maintain that mindset. Don't trust the cop. Rule two is don't talk to the police. So what would you do in that situation if a cop comes up to you and you think they're after you? What would you do? Well, the more kind of traditional, kind of old school know your rights rule you'll see in a lot of YouTube videos, and we can talk about that a little bit. But those old YouTube videos that people may or may not be aware of aren't the best advice. So the thing that you don't want to do is you don't want to start talking to the cops, which is what people oftentimes do on YouTube, where they stop and they say, "Officer, am I being detained? Am I free to go?" And then the officer starts, depending on what the officer says, you can leave or not leave. Instead, the reason for that is because our rule number one, don't trust the police. They can lie to you, they can trick you. Our rule number two is don't talk to them. And so what you don't want to do is you don't want to start a conversation by asking them if you're being detained. Because if police are oftentimes trained and oftentimes will say something, like you may get some cops that will say yes or no, but most cops will say something like, "I don't know, should I detain you? Or why do you think I should detain you?" What they're doing is they're opening that conversation. And you don't want to do that, because the police are very, very good at taking conversations and kind of manipulating them, and getting people to talk and open up.
Yeah.
What you want to do is you want to say, "Sorry, officer, I can't talk right now," and turn and try to walk away. So if you're walking down the street, you're at a bus stop or something like that, you want to say, "Sorry, I can't talk right now," and turn and walk away. One example that I use in Know Your Rights training sometimes for folks is the example of if you're at a bar and somebody comes up and wants to hit on you, and you want to say, "Sorry, I'm not interested," and you want to turn your body and give some sort of actual physical manifestation of your unwillingness not to talk to them. Because if you don't do that, if you just say, "Sorry, I can't talk right now," or "Sorry, I don't want to talk," and you stand there, the police officer will continue to talk to you. The person on the bar will continue to talk to you. So what you want to say is you want to say, "Sorry, I can't talk right now," turn and walk away. The reason I say that, go ahead.
I mean, just as sort of like a reality check for me, like if, I'm walking and a police officer stops me and I say, "Sorry, I don't want to talk," and just kind of walk away, that feels a little scary to do,
Yeah.
right? So, I mean, but what you're saying is that that's perfectly okay to do that.
Legally, it's perfectly okay to do it. There's no reason not to do that. So this is why we think about our first rule, which is don't trust. So what's happening is an armed member of a paramilitary that's given powers by the state is trying to stop and talk to you, and you don't trust them. You don't want to engage with them. And so what you should do is you should say, "Sorry, I can't talk right now," and try to walk away. The reason that I suggest people, they say, "Sorry, I can't talk right now," try to walk away, is it feels less awkward than what could be even more scary, which is, because I'm not going to talk to you. Am I being detained? Something to that effect.
Mm-hmm.
And that for most people, it's just like if you're walking down the street and somebody from ACLU or someone from Greenpeace or someone from Save Our Children or a canvasser wants to talk to you, right? You don't have to be rude to people. If you don't want to talk right now, you can just say, "Oh, I'm sorry, right now I can't talk." Right? You don't even have to say, "I'm not interested." With the police, you don't even have to say, "I don't trust you. You can lie to me. You can trick me." You don't have to say any of that. You can just say, "Sorry, I can't talk right now," and try to walk away.
And then
For
I also
most
want
people,
to, I also want to just caveat here again, and reinforce the distinctions that you were making before, is like, this is the things to legally protect you, but there's always going to be, the considerations to like what you're saying, street smarts. Like there are different ways in which people have to essentially survive with police interactions. So, again, I just want to reinforce, you're making a general sort of point as far as like how to legally protect yourself. But there are situations and circumstances, like for me, people can't see me, but I'm a balding brown guy, that
Right.
look like any number of, whatever country that people want to assume that I'm from. But like, so my street smarts may in that moment may require something different.
Right. Well, and um, that's true, and that's why I don't talk about street smarts, right?
Yeah.
Because it could be different. If you think that you're likely to be pulled into an alleyway and beaten up or something to that effect,
Hmm.
there could be different things that you want to do based on your street smart,
Yeah.
right?
All right. Sorry. I didn't
What
mean to, I just wanted to
no, that's
add.
totally true. What I would suggest though, is that in most situations, if you think the cops are targeting you, regardless of your socio-political, your ethnic background or whatnot, then most situations, if you say, "Hey, I'm sorry, I can't talk right now," and try to walk away, that most people, if someone walks up to you and is like, "Hey, blah blah blah," and you're just like, "Sorry, I can't talk right now," and try to walk away, it may be a little jarring for people. Most people will just let you walk away,
Yeah.
and that's true also for most cops in a situation, and that in a lot of situations that is actually what may be true. And if you don't try to get out of the situation and instead you engage with them in some other way, it could be more dangerous. So, for example, if your street smarts tell you to run, um, a lot of cops will just chase you if you run,
Yeah.
and they'll pull a taser on you, and that's much more scary. If you stop there and actually start engaging with them as like, what's this about, blah 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 blah, and they're actually targeting you, what you're doing is you're just giving them an opening to gather information about you, your friends, your family, and that it's less likely that you'll be able to escape that situation. And that really, truly, this the the safest thing to do, and really in a lot of situations, the street smart thing to do is just try to get out of them. And
Yeah.
so this is why I suggest people that they say, "Sorry, I can't talk right now." Um, the sorry is disarming. It's not
Hmm.
being challenging. I can't talk right now. That's like a normal thing that people say in a lot of situations. And then you try to move and walk away.
No, I
Uh,
mean, I think it's great because like it almost immediately feels like a de-escalation because like when you're talking like am I detained, am I being arrested or whatever, like it very quickly creates like this adversarial interaction, right, like you were talking about. And
the
this
best
way that you're saying it seems like a like an easy de-escalating way to kind of maneuver out of it.
and the vast majority of police officers are going to be males, right?
Hmm.
And you know, and especially if you're male, even if you're not male, oftentimes the cops will say, like, I'm not trained to de-escalate, even regardless of what the policies are, regardless of what the training should be. Like, or the way I de-escalate is by escalating. Like you'll start getting a situation or you'll get like chest bumping, right? If and in some ways it'll make the cops more and more angry and kind of
Hmm.
threaten them to like, it'll turn into a contest of authority. That'll bring out all of those toxic male traits that we all talk about in other contexts out in that situation. And so, I mean, I really think that even though I know I talked for a long time about saying I'm not giving people street smart advice, I actually think that saying in most situations, regardless of the color of your skin, what sort of clothes you're wearing, what sort of context you're in, that in a lot of situations, saying sorry, I can't talk right now, I'm trying to walk away, is actually a good way to try to get out of the situation. Because anything else is just going to prolong that
Yeah.
contact, and prolonging that contact is going to be more and more dangerous because you're not challenging their authority. You're just trying to get out of there.
Yeah.
Here's what you'll learn. And this is why you also don't even ask, am I being detained? Is that in most situations, if you say, sorry, I can't talk right now, and try to walk away, or let's say you're at a bus stop, so you're turning your back, or let's say you're at a picket line, so you're just like stepping a couple feet away, you're doing some sort of physical manifestation of that unwillingness to talk, because you don't just want to stand there. If you just stand there and say, sorry, I can't talk right now, they will keep talking to you. But otherwise, if you try to turn your back or you try to walk away, one of two things is going to happen. Either A, they're going to let you go, and then the encounter is over, right? And you successfully negotiated that know your rights experience. Or they will say, no, 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 you can't walk away, or no, I'm talking to you, or stop, or they'll use something. At that point in time, that's what the law calls a show of authority or a show of official authority. And it's when a state actor, that is somebody that's part of the government, uses a show of authority to interfere with your ability to walk away or your ability to turn away or not talk to them. They require you to talk to them, even if that's either like a hand on the shoulder, or them saying stop, or them giving a like a a sign with their hand, or giving you any sort of order, any sort of official show of authority. What the law says, and all the jurisdictions I'm aware of, says that that's what transitions from a mere encounter, just like a regular encounter, just like you'd have with someone on the street or at a store or whatnot, to a stop. And a stop is also known as a seizure.
Yeah.
And there's two different types of seizures. There's temporary seizures, which are oftentimes called Terry stops or detentions, or mere stops or temporary stops. And then there's more permanent stops, which we call arrest.
And what we're talking about right now is, even though it may sound semantically similar or synonymous, like what's the, like we're talking about, but these are all things that have been defined legally. Like,
Right.
these are all, what you're talking about is like kind of like a sliding scale of different types of interactions. And, so the terms that you're using are very specific.
I am. And these are all terms of art that lawyers and judges and police are trained. So
Mhm.
when the cops are trained, this, when I say cops, I mean FBI agents, ICE agents, everyone, anyone with law enforcement powers, when they're trained in their ability to interfere with people's liberty, and like when they're able to like make people talk to them and not, they're being taught all of these terms. What they're taught is they're taught that generally before shows of authority, it's what they call a mere encounter or an ordinary encounter, and they have the same rights to talk to people just like any of us do, right? So when you're walking down the street and you see someone you like their shoes, you can be like, "Hey, buddy, nice shoes." Or you have a crush on someone, you'd be like, "Hey, I'd love to get your number." Or you just want to like talk to somebody about anything, or you just want to tell someone a joke, like, "Hey, you want to hear a joke?" Cops can do the same thing. The law says those are mere encounters. The law says that mere encounters for cops can engage in all sorts of things, like things that people normally wouldn't ever say. Like, "Hey, have you seen a black guy in a red hoodie running?" That would be a mere encounter for the cops. And the cops are trained that they can ask those questions in any situation. It's only when they use shows of authority in a way that would make a normal kind of what we call, lawyers call a reasonably prudent person, like your imaginary reasonable person, your imaginary like ordinary person. They would do something that would make that imaginary ordinary person feel like they were not able to walk away. So that includes a hand on the shoulder, a stop symbol with your hand, an order like stop, or any sort of indication that they have to talk to you. That requires the police to have some level of suspicion to do that, or a warrant. So they either need a warrant or they need an exception to the warrant requirement. The most common exceptions to the warrant requirement are what we call a Terry stop, which is like a mere detention, where if cops have what they call reasonable suspicion of a crime, or that you're a witness to a crime, they can stop you. Or they can actually arrest you, which is a more permanent detention if they have probable cause. Now, we could talk for hours about the difference, like what reasonable suspicion is, what probable cause is. That's a frequent area that lawyers and judges have to litigate, right? Where I will, take a whole list of facts in court and say, "Judge, there wasn't reasonable suspicion here because all the cops knew was X, Y, and Z." We could talk about that for a long time. It's not really important for our purposes from a know your rights standpoint, because whether they're arresting you or they're detaining you, it sort of doesn't really matter. Because the main thing you want to know is this: when you say, "Sorry, I can't talk right now," and try to walk away, if they let you walk away, walk away. Don't talk to the cops. Safest thing to do, right? And we know that from our first rule because we don't trust them. They're out to get us, right? They'll trick us. They'll be dishonest. You don't want to talk to somebody that's like that. They're trying to ruin your life. Blah blah blah. You want to get out of there. So if you say, "Sorry, I can't talk right now," and try to walk away, then you just walk away. They don't let you walk away. At that point in time, you know that like a constitutionally significant event has happened. They are interfering with their liberty. At that point in time, you really know you don't want to talk to them. And it's at that point in time that they don't let you walk away, that legally the safest thing to do is to invoke your right to remain silent and ask the lawyer. So what you say is I'm going to remain silent and want to see a lawyer. And so you say, okay, well, I'm going to remain silent and want to see a lawyer. So what I would do, like if I was at like a protest situation and a cop walked up to me and was like, hey, let me talk to you for a second. I would say, sorry, I can't talk right now. Try to walk away. If they didn't let me walk away, I would say, okay, I'm going to remain silent and want to see a lawyer. And then I wouldn't say another thing until they let me go.
Yeah. So, when you say I'm going to remain silent, I mean, there's remaining silent and there's remaining silent. Does remaining silent mean like literally you don't say anything else?
Yep.
And you just say I'm remain silent, so I want to see an attorney? Or does remain silent mean I'm not going to talk to you, and if the police keep asking you questions and kind of poking you like how the weather is or that kind of stuff, but still stopping you, is that remaining silent? I mean, when you're not talking about things, I mean, what are you saying? Is it because like you're saying, like the cops kind of trick you. So
Yeah.
yeah.
So the easiest thing way to think about it is, and the law actually talks about this, it's like a light switch. Right? A light switch is either on or off, right? The light's either on or off. And so when you've invoked your rights, you either invoke them or you waive them. And so you say, I'm going to remain silent and want to see a lawyer. You turn the light switch on. And then if 5 minutes later, you're like, well, okay, maybe I am willing to talk to you about a little bit. You've turned that light switch off and the light's off.
Mm-hmm.
And then they can talk to you about all sorts of things.
Yeah.
Now, I mean, cops are tricky, right? Remember our rule number one. And so they've tried a lot of different strategies in the past, and the strategies have gotten be analyzed by judges. And so, right, what the judges will have said is they said that if someone has invoked their right to remain silent and see a lawyer, the cops are no longer legally allowed to question in most situations. They're no longer legally allowed to question them. And they're also not allowed to do things that would be reasonably thought of to require a response. They can't do things that would be kind of tempting people into talking. So but cops do this all the time.
Mm-hmm.
So for example, if you say, well, I'm going to remain silent, want to see a lawyer, the cop can't be like, okay, fine. You don't have to respond to us. I just want to tell you, this is your one chance. If you don't talk to us right now, the judge is going to send you prison. You're going to be locked in a hole for 30 years. This is your one chance. Blah 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 blah. What the judges have said that cops are not allowed to do that. Now they still do that in different situations. This actually happened to me once. So before I was in law school, I got detained in Sacramento, California. There'd been a protest that had happened around that time, and I was being detained in Sacramento, California. I was walking downtown in Sacramento. Some cops saw me and they thought maybe I had information or been part of a protest, and they said, "Hey, I want to talk to you." And I said, "Sorry, I can't talk right now," and tried to walk away. They're like, "No, no, 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 you have to talk to us." And I said, "Okay, I'm going to remain silent. Want to see a lawyer?" They sat me on a curb, and I could tell they wanted to talk to me, but they chose not to talk to me. And I thought to myself, "Oh, this is a good cop." And just for the difference in good cops and bad cops is they may both try to get you, but the good cops will follow the rules when trying to destroy your life or ruin your family's life, and the bad cops will break the rules, right? But they'll both try to get you. And so I could tell that I was being detained. I was sitting on a sidewalk in Sacramento, and I could tell that they wanted to question me, but they couldn't. And so what the cop did is the cop took out a cell phone and started having a loud conversation with another police officer over the cell phone about me within my hearing, trying, I think, to get me to start talking. And he started saying stuff like, "Yep, yeah, we got one of the protesters." Well, I don't know. I mean, I think he's one of the protesters, but he won't talk to us. He's like he, like like he thinks he's a lawyer or something like that. And it's not going to like this. The sergeant's not going to like this. And who's not going to like this? The judge isn't going to like this. And they're really going to hammer this guy. Kind of talking in kind of that way about me, trying to scare me.
Yeah.
Trying to get me to be like, whoa, 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 maybe I should talk, or like, what do you, like, maybe we can make a deal here, or like, just, whoa, whoa, what do you mean they're going to hammer me? Or what do you think? What do you mean Sarge isn't going to like that? That sort of thing. And, but what I did is I just stayed silent. I said, I'm going to remain silent. Want to see a lawyer? I didn't turn the light switch on and off. And after about 20 or 30 minutes, they let me go. Now, the reason that they let me go after 20, 30 minutes is because they couldn't get any extra information to be able to increase what they thought they had reasonable suspicion to increase their probable cause to arrest me. And it's unclear what the difference is between a Terry stop or a temporary detention and an arrest. It's different in different jurisdictions, but generally it's around 20 or 30 minutes. And at that point in time, they either have to let you go or they have to arrest you.
And I
Um,
think that's what people are scared about, right? Like, the cops are saying, or law enforcement saying, we're gonna have to take you in. You're not, it's gonna be you're gonna be in jail and all this kind of stuff. And I think what you're saying is you invoke your rights, sit there, you just have to maybe wait, for a little bit of time before they release you, no matter how uncomfortable that may feel or how scary that may feel. If there's nothing else, they're not going to arrest you. They still may
right,
arrest you. It would be illegal,
right.
but they'll,
Or
yeah,
or they have probable cause on something else, and they could still arrest you. Here's the difference: is that you're more likely to limit your options and to get yourself into more trouble if you talk
yeah.
100%. And that's true no matter what. So, you know, I've done lots of cases where, as part of the criminal case, the prosecution has played like an hour and a half long interrogation of my client, where my client has talked to people, and that could be on a badge cam, or that could be back in the station house, or it could be. I had a case once where it was at a cafe, and it wasn't a video in that situation; it was just a recording, but where they were playing essentially interrogations or conversations. And in the cases where my clients made confessions or statements that didn't help them, it was horrible for their case.
Hmm.
And in the cases where my clients thought they were helping themselves, sometimes they gave information that they didn't realize they were given. It was horrible for their case. And also, I had lots of cases where the cops were just being like, we're confronting the client with the allegations and um, saying, well, your daughter said you did this, and your daughter said you did that. What did you do? It was horrible for the case, because what happened is, in any situation where the cops were able to interrogate the person, a video was put on of the cops either talking about the allegations that got to the jury. Oftentimes, people, when they would deny things, um, any sort of denial would be picked apart. So if they denied too quickly, like, the prosecutor would say, "Did you hear how quickly he denied that?
Hmm.
He must be guilty." If they denied too slow, "Could you hear how long it took him to deny that? He must he must be guilty." Essentially, any situation where they get you in an uncomfortable situation, they get video or recording of it, of them questioning you, even if you've denied things, will be used against you. Right?
Yeah.
So the classic Miranda statements that were, kind of formulated by Thurgood Marshall, said, like, anything you say can and will be used against you. They mean that. And I will say, anything you don't say, like anything that we say to you and you respond to in any way, can and will be used against you.
And how you say it.
And how you say it, exactly. And so
Just for listeners,
essentially, it's like a no-win situation.
that was
You
Zach
know,
Winston chiming in. He joined us on the podcast. So yeah.
it's a no-win situation. The best way to deal with police when they want to talk to you is not talk to them, and to not let them talk to you, right? And so if you invoke your right to remain silent, they're not allowed to sit there on video and talk to you for 20 minutes and just have you be quiet over and over and over again. Or if they did do that, you could get a judge to throw that out.
I remember a criminal defense attorney telling me a long time ago, um, there is 100% downside from the moment you start speaking. Like there is no upside. There's no way that you can help yourself by talking to law enforcement. And if there is, even if you just remain silent and wait for your attorney and discuss that with an attorney, the attorney will be able to evaluate whether or not whatever information you have will actually be helpful. But he was saying that the moment you start speaking, basically you're just doing self-inflicted harm at that point. And at that point, it just becomes a matter of degree. Like I think the point that you're making, how everything can be used against you no matter what.
Yeah, and so this is why criminal defense attorneys like myself, folks from the activist communities such as myself, say that you don't talk to the cops. And so what you want to do is, they don't let you walk away. You want to invoke your right to remain silent, ask a lawyer, so they can't then question you. Um, but you'll also see this, like, if you look on YouTube for like advice that cops would give. Sometimes you'll get like old detectives that are like giving the advice, or are giving advice to people on what they would tell their children. Same advice, same exact advice. There's no upside to talking to the cops in most situations. And if there is an upside, you want a lawyer there with you to guarantee that there's some sort of contractual benefit to you talking. And
And it is,
otherwise they'll screw you. Because again, I'm going to go back to our first rule, which is you can't trust the cops. They're going to lie to you. They're going to trick you. You know, I'll just say kind of like interestingly, I come from, my politics are progressive on like the left side of the spectrum. Generally, of course, I don't agree with everything everyone says on the left side of the spectrum, but that's been my perspective. And a fascinating thing watching what was happening during the Biden administration, especially with like the January 6th prosecutions, is all of a sudden I started hearing a lot of criticisms of behaviors from the FBI and from law enforcement coming from the right. And those are criticisms I was like, oh yeah, those are true criticisms. An interesting thing is, regardless of your politics, regardless of how you think a just society should be formed, regardless of how you think that workers and bosses should treat each other, or, what you think your tax, what fair taxing is, or what we should do with the environment, or, regardless of any of your stances on any of those positions, that one of the most interesting things for me to observe was when the law enforcement, FBI, local law enforcement started targeting folks on the right. They had the same exact complaints about cops being dishonest, untrustworthy, using tricks, and just trying to kind of ruin people's lives, regardless of any of the context. And it's just the truth of the matter, right? So, the advice I'm giving folks today is the same advice that should have been taken by the January 6th suspects and defendants. Essentially, this is true for anybody. It's the same advice that should have been used by members of Trump's cabinet in his 2016 regime, right? And I'll expand upon that. Part of the reason you don't want to trust the cops is for all the reasons I was saying, because they'll use anything you say against them. They'll use anything you don't say against them. But also they'll use other tricks. And so this is especially true for federal agents. I talked about this a little bit with the Trey Arrow case, is generally when we ask questions, when people ask each other questions, because they want to know the answer to the question. They don't know what the other person's going to say, right? Like when I ask someone and I say, hey, how was your day? I don't know how their day was going, right? Or like, hey, do you know, Bobbin, do you know Zach? It's because I don't know if you guys know each other. That's generally the reason people ask. That's not why law enforcement, especially federal law enforcement, ask the question. What they do in any sort of investigation is they learn as much about that person, about the group, about the situation as possible. And then they ask questions they already know the answer to. Because it's a crime if you lie to them. And so, in the Trey Arrow case, when they're showing Angela Cesario, who was a snitch in that case, pictures about other people involved, and say, hey, Angie, do you know these people? And Angie said, no, I don't know those people, but they knew that she did. They are able to charge her with different counts of 18 USC 1001, which is a crime. It's an offense under the federal code that says that if you knowingly provide false information to a federal agent acting within their jurisdiction, like an FBI agent investigating a crime, that is subject to 5 years in prison or 8 years if they're doing a domestic terrorism investigation. So they'll already ask questions they already know the answer to. And this is one of the main tools that federal law enforcement use. They used it in the end-around prosecution. I met a young woman whose father was in prison for Medicare fraud, but it was mostly they got him for lying about his billing practices as a doctor. This is the same tactics that the FBI used in going after members of the Trump administration in 2016, asking them questions about their involvement in Ukrainian and Russian politics. They asked people questions they already knew the answers to, and those people lied to the FBI about it, and then they were charged not necessarily with some of the actual substantive crimes, but they were charged with providing false information to the FBI agent. Same exact reason. This is the same reason that Martha Stewart went to prison.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think just to reinforce the point, don't talk to law enforcement.
Don't trust the cops. It's dangerous. They'll just gather information they'll use
Yeah.
against you in a case. They'll gather information they'll use against your friends and family member. Or if you actually lie to the law enforcement um, through any way and they know, they'll charge you with a crime.
And just to say that's not uncommon because like you're in a scary situation and people are going to deny something or misremember or whatever it is, like they're just scared. It's just like a natural human instinct, but to defend yourself or to protect yourself, and sometimes that manifests in lies.
And an old law professor of mine who later was one of the attorney generals of Oregon, and before he was a law professor, he was a U.S. attorney, and he was part of the Enron prosecution, and he did some of the post 9/11 like domestic terrorism prosecution, like mob prosecutions. He was a U.S. attorney out in New York. He used to tell us, and I don't know. I mean, I assume this is true. I don't know why he would be fudging on it. But he used to say that there was a policy, and whether it was actually written in the USA Attorney Manual or is just kind of a policy in practice, I don't know. But there's a policy that they called a one free kick, which is that 18 USC 1001, using that statute to get people for lying to the cops was so it was so commonplace that people would lie to law enforcement almost as a reaction, whether they meant to or not, that they would give people one free kick. That is, they would give people one free lie. Because otherwise it felt so dishonest and kind of underhanded that the U.S. Attorney's Office and the FBI office didn't feel like it was fair when they were targeting the mob and, you know, um, foreign terrorists and, folks. So they'd give them one free kick. Um, yeah, I mean, the point is that psychologically, if the cops come up to you and ask you a question, and if you think they're out to get you, most people, even if they don't mean to lie, may want to lie initially,
Do you,
right?
do you think I mean, talking about the importance of it, do you think it's not generally a situation that many people find themselves in often, and so it can be
Right.
kind of overwhelming and scary? Would you recommend that people rehearse it, role play it to try and build that muscle memory? Because everything will happen so quickly when these things happen.
I mean, the quick answer is yes, I would. And I'll get back to that. But I just want to highlight that, Zach, you're exactly right. People are not in this situation normal. And the police know that. And so part of our rule number one, which is they'll use different strategies to trick you into it, is that they know how to psychologically pressure people into talking to them. And so what they'll do is they'll purposefully go and they'll approach people when they're in situations that will maximize that discomfort. They'll show up at your house right after dinner, time they think they have dinner, talk to people there when they easily could have come to your office. They'll show up, they'll follow you and talk to you in the mall because they think that you'll be like, how are you know that I'm here in the mall, right? They'll call people in a way to purposefully make them kind of more psychologically vulnerable, and they do that on purpose, and they're trained to do so. And then that's not even to talk about if you're actually pulled into a station house and you're actually interrogated. There's entire trainings, entire certifications that law enforcement interrogators go through. The most famous one is called the Reed method, where they're trained how to maximize people's discomfort and to make people feel so off balance that they will start giving information and start making admissions or confessions that they otherwise normally wouldn't. So the answer is, do I, so that's why we don't play games with them at all. That's why we just say, sorry, I can't talk to you right now. Try to walk away. If they don't let you walk away, you invoke your right to remain silent, ask the lawyer. Now, practicing doing that is really, really smart to do. And I've done that with folks in Know Your Rights trainings, where if you're part of a group of people that you think is being actively targeted by the police. So, for example, in here, I live in Portland, Oregon. In Portland, Oregon, there was a time about 15 years ago or so where the local Portland Police Bureau and folks from the Joint Terrorism Task Force, so FBI agents and whatnot, were targeting local members of kind of like the anarchist punk community here. And they were engaging in search warrants and they were raiding people's homes and they were talking to people. And folks from that community asked me to come and do Know Your Rights training. I gave them all this information, and then we actually stood up and we practiced over and over and over again. If the cops come up to you or they knock on your door, what do you do? And people actually practice saying, sorry, I can't talk right now, try to walk away. And then they practice invoking the right to remain silent, asking a lawyer if they weren't allowed to walk away. So yeah, I mean, that is the preferable thing. Like if you're part of a group where you think you're actively being targeted, it would be just as important as doing role plays in any sort of like prep situation, whether it's like first aid or de-escalation, nonviolent communication, all of that situation. It's definitely good. And also, if it's not clear, the reason I keep saying all of my rules over and over and over again is because I'm trying to use all of the different pedagogical techniques and getting it into people's brain. So.
Yeah. I was just going to say the gaming and like the training, it's just to reinforce there's not a way in which even the best of us are going to be able to outmaneuver, outthink, or outgame law enforcement. Like it's just a losing proposition. And so to think like somehow you can engage in a way that you're not going to be like fall into some sort of like trap or something like that, it's kind of wishful thinking because it's a professionally trained group of people. Even if the whole point of them engaging in conversation that feels like clumsy or casual or, aloof, it's all intentional. Like there's nothing not intentional about in the way in which law enforcement engages you. Again, if you're being targeted or,
Yeah.
feel like they're up to you.
Sometimes people who are being targeted by the cops, whether that's like subcultural groups or whatnot, folks make themselves feel better by dehumanizing their enemy. And sometimes folks will tell these jokes or they'll be like memes or cartoons or whatnot about like the dumb police officer or something like that. And, I mean, cops are just like anyone else. Detectives are just like anyone else. There are some folks who are smarter than other folks. Some of them are like amazingly smart. But here's the thing that I want people to understand about especially detectives or cops. Part of their job that they do every day is they try to enforce their will upon other people. They try to get people to talk to them and open up and talk to them. And so if you have a detective that's been a detective, a cop for 8 years and a detective for 9 years, and has been like on the force for 17 years, or an FBI agent that's been working for the FBI for 12 years and whatnot, that they have experience day in and day out of every week trying to enforce their will upon people. They've both been trained by experts, and they also have that real life experience where they have tried strategy A. If strategy A doesn't work, then they pivot to strategy B. If strategy B doesn't work, then they pivot to strategy C. They're essentially using what are sometimes called A/B tests all the time. They're like, how will people react if I do this? How will people react if I do that? How's someone going to react if I raise my voice? How's someone going to react if I lean in too close? Right? Is a woman going to react to me differently than a man? Is a black person going to react to me differently than a white guy? Right? All of these different tests and all these different situations, you get people with day in, day out experience trying to enforce their will on other people, trying to get people to open up, to respond to them, either give them information or to feel off balance or whatnot. And this is why sometimes if you've ever talked to a cop, you'll actually see this happening, where the cop will be really friendly and that's not working. And then they'll stop and they'll pivot and then they'll be kind of aggressive. And then they'll lean forward. They're actually trained and have the experience in doing all of this stuff. They're just trying all their different strategies to try to enforce their will upon you. And really, in most situations, the only way to actually not lose that situation is to not be in it. And it's certainly legally the safest thing to do, is try to get out of it. And so that's why, detectives on YouTube, criminal defense lawyers such as myself, anyone that's been targeted is going to tell you over and over and over again, don't target. I'll just say that, all the literature, there's even terminologies for all of this. There's a terminology that is used called a false exculpatory, which is where people think that they're getting themselves out of trouble by saying something, but actually they're getting themselves into trouble, right? So like a perfect example would be if the cops know who you are and they ask you your name and you give them a fake name, well, you've just committed a crime and you just have given them a lever that they can use against you if they know that you've lied to them. So you think that giving them a fake name is going to exculpate yourself, it's going to get you out of trouble. It's actually a false exculpatory that's going to get you into trouble. And I have like a little hobby where um, I'll like save police reports or transcripts where they actually make a big deal about false exculpatories in police reports because people try to talk their way out of trouble, but end up talking their way into trouble all the time. So that's why, really, again, the Miranda warnings are true. Anything you say can will be used against you. So you don't want to say anything. So that's rule two, and those are really our most important. Rule three that I go through with Know Your Rights, um, which is similar, it has to do with searches. So any sort of search the cop wants to do, whether they want to look in your teeth, to look at your 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 molars, for like bite marks or something like that, or they want to look through your eyeglasses to see what your prescription's like. They want to look at the bottom of your shoe, or they want to look in your phone, or they want to look, in your bag or in your wallet. Any sort of search. They want to look in your house. In order to do a search, they need a warrant or a warrant exception, and that's the Fourth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. And then most states, if not all the states, have a Fourth Amendment equivalent. Oregon's Fourth Amendment equivalent is Article 1, Section 9 of the Oregon Constitution. Requires them to have a warrant or a reasonable or have a warrant or a warrant exception. And so the most common warrant exception is consent. And so police, whether it's FBI, ICE, whoever, will always ask you for consent before they pat you down, before they come in the house, anything like that. Now, if you don't consent, they may still search you anyway, right? They may have a warrant and they may think they have another exception to the warrant requirement. They may still search you anyway. But the safest thing that you can do, the best thing you can do, keep you the safest, is to always say that you do not consent to a search. So what I would do if a cop walks up to me is I would say, sorry, I can't talk right now. Try to walk away. If they don't let you walk away, say, I'm going to remain silent, want to see a lawyer. And then if they want to search anything, if they don't let me walk away, if they keep me there, they want to look at my wallet, what I do, I would just say, I don't consent to a search. I don't consent to a search. So they want to look at my wallet, I'd say, I don't consent to a search. And the reason you do that is because if they find anything and you don't consent, maybe it can get thrown out later. If you do consent, it's going to be good. So, as I said before, I'm a regular criminal defense lawyer. I do all sorts of cases, sex and drugs and violence and all that stuff. And so I had a case once where a guy was stopped driving. He was stopped because they thought he was a meth dealer or whatever. And they stopped him not for just a traffic violation. And they asked him if they could search his car. He said no, because he was a fan of the YouTube videos. And they searched his trunk anyway, and they found an entire meth lab in his trunk. This happened to be a situation where they had recording of him refusing consent. And so the cops weren't able to lie and say that he consented. And so, it took a while, but eventually, as a lawyer on appeal, I was able to get him out of prison. And because the trial judge should have thrown that search out of the trunk. But he lost at trial. He went to prison for a year. It took a year and a half to get him out of prison. But because he said, I do not consent to a search, he got out of prison, 6 or 7 years earlier than he would have. And so, the best thing you can do in any sort of search situation is say, I do not consent to a search. They may still search you. Now, I just want to highlight why you're saying really clearly, I'm going to remain silent and want to see a lawyer, or I do not consent. Because again, what you're reminding the good cops to be good cops. You're reminding the cops that will still try to ruin your life, your family's life, your friend's life, that they have to follow the rules. And some of them will follow the rules. If they don't have a warrant or an exception to the warrant requirements, they won't search you. The bad cops may search you anyway, but you're creating a record. So nowadays where there's more and more badge cams, right? Like the Portland police have badge cams. People pull their phones out. There's witnesses. You're saying clearly, I do not consent to a search, or I'm going to remain silent and want to see a lawyer. You're creating a record so that record can be presented to a judge later on and can hopefully help you the best. No guarantee, right? Because they could have a valid warrant or they could have a valid exception of the warrant. But if you consent, there is no argument. And so the safest thing you can do in any sort of search situation is say, I do not consent to a search. Yeah, and that's rule 3. And those 3 rules really are the things that are the most important in my view from a know your rights perspective. Don't trust the cops. Don't talk to the cops. Don't consent to searches.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really useful advice. The I don't consent to searches. I mean, again, another one that's very hard to do. It feels very intimidating when people are just like, let me just search you. What do you got to hide? You let me search you if you had nothing to hide, type of thing. And, when you have someone, like you said, that's basically in paramilitary gear, asking you forcefully, it's not really an ask as much as, it feels really terrifying to be able to stand back and push back. But the fact is our Constitution is particularly it's created to prevent this type of stuff from happening. I mean that whether it prevents it from the outset or whether you are able to vindicate those rights at a later time. I think the point that you're making is you're doing it hopefully to prevent it to have law enforcement actually behave well. But if at a backstop, what you're trying to do is to ensure that you can vindicate those rights at a later time and ensure that the judge or whatever recognizes the violation of your constitutional rights.
Well, and like if you think the cops are out to get you, they're not going to treat you. They're not going to treat you fairly, right? So you could get bad cops who will plant evidence, and if you don't consent to a search, they won't have an opportunity to plant evidence, right? Or if you don't talk to them, they won't have the opportunity to lie about what you said to them. Also, just like people think that they have nothing to hide, maybe they don't know. Like if the cops already think that they're after you anyway for whatever reason, and like a perfect example would be, you know, a lot of men, women too, but a lot of men carry pocket knives in Oregon. Any of those pocket knives that you can take and can flick open, right? Then not necessarily there's a button, but just that you can flick open. Those are all, if you're carrying that knife in a way that's concealed, where someone doesn't know that that's a knife, that's a crime in Oregon.
Mm-hmm.
It's unlawful, that's carrying a concealed weapon. And that is what's called a blade that can be opened by centrifugal force. And, that's a sort of crime that is not charged against people all the time. Cops, just everyone carries knives that can be flipped open. And cops frequently won't charge people for it, except they'll charge people when they want to get them for something else or if they're targeting for something else. So, like, I've done these cases where, you'll get people of color on the coast in Oregon that kind of mouthed off to the cops, or the cops are just like suspicious of them or don't want them there. They're being charged with carrying concealed knives in their pockets, right? And so if they didn't consent to being patted down or whatnot, it's possible that those knives could then be thrown out. Because the way that our legal system, one of the ways our legal system deals when cops are searching people unlawfully is that they suppress the evidence.
Yeah.
Another perfect example is, for most prescription drugs, you're required to have the prescription with you. That's why prescription bottles have the prescription printed on the bottle itself. And so, if you are like my grandmother, where you have one of those, weekly planners, like, I take these 4 drugs on Monday and these 4 drugs on Tuesday and these 4 drugs on Wednesday, and it's all set up and you don't have the bottle with you, you don't have your prescription bottle with you, that could be a violation of the Controlled Substance Act, right? So you start getting in situations where, like as a society, we have criminalized so many different behaviors that we rely on prosecutor's offices exercising their discretion to not prosecute people in situations that are inherently not criminal, right? And we would have this idea that grand juries would be a filter, but they're not, right? There's the classic, this is a whole other podcast, but the grand juries are not a protection or a restriction on the prosecutor. Sometimes juries are, but still, like once you've actually been charged and prosecuted for having a common pocket knife or carrying your prescription drugs in a weekly planner or whatever, like a weekly sorter or whatever it is, like you've had to go through thousands of dollars, scores and scores of hours going to court, annoyance and whatnot. And it's all because a cop just didn't like you. They didn't like how you looked. You reminded them of something they didn't like. You were at a protest and they didn't agree with the protest. They wanted to harass you in a way because they thought you were an immigrant, right? And so you'll get MAGA cops who know that they can't call ICE. They shouldn't call ICE. Maybe they won't, but maybe they don't like immigrants, and so they're going to harass people and try to get people to stop or at least get out of their county. I mean, this is a classic situation. That's why we have movies about it. Of cops targeting people. And one of the best ways that you can, for whatever reason they're targeting you, the best ways, in my view, that you can protect yourself is don't trust them, don't talk to them, don't consent to a search.
So we're, just at over an hour now, but one last thing, you mentioned it about names. If a law enforcement officer asks your name, can you clarify like what the rule is here?
So in Oregon, the rules you don't have to identify yourself unless you're driving a car. So if you're driving a car, you have to have a driver's license. And if you don't hand that driver's license over, that can be a violation. It's not a crime. It's just kind of like a speeding ticket, like a fancy speeding ticket, a violation. Otherwise than that, you don't have to give your name. It doesn't subject you to extra charges. If you're being arrested or detained and you don't give them your driver's license, you could end up being detained for longer or arrested for longer, but you won't be charged extra. You won't
And
be
that's
given
only because they're trying to, at that point, claiming to confirm your identity, right?
yeah, they're saying like, oh, we need to hold on to you, or we can't, or like, so like once you've been arrested. So I mean, this is something that we should talk about. Is if someone's been arrested, and you know, sometimes what will happen is a release officer will want to come and ask you like your name, where you work, where you live, who you live with, that sort of situation. They're asking you information that's not supposed to be relevant to the case, the reason you're there, but relevant to your release decision, whether or not they can release you with a bond or without a bond, that is with bail or without a bail, you know, what they would recommend to the judge. If you don't cooperate and you don't talk to them, it's possible you'll stay in jail for longer, but you just won't get extra charges. And so that's a good situation where it kind of be up to people's decision on what they should do. Like if you have a warrant, like if you live in Oregon, but there's a felony warrant out for your arrest in Minnesota, and you give them your name, they find that felony warrant. Well, that would have been a lot of a worse outcome than if you hadn't talked to them and they couldn't identify you. But also, if you don't identify yourself, you could end up in jail for longer. Well, they can either identify you or they just give up.
Good to know.
So similarly, the same thing could be true if you interact with the cops and they don't let you walk away and they want to detain you and they want your driver's license. Legally, you're under no requirement in Oregon to give them your driver's license. In some jurisdictions, they have stop and identify statutes that say that if they have a reasonable suspicion to stop you, that if you don't give them your ID, that can be a crime.
Okay.
But it's kind of beyond my purview to tell you which states. Some states just authorize the cops to ask, but you actually won't be charged. Some states, they have to have probable cause. It's kind of a mess right now.
All right.
That's the Hibble case out of Nevada that allowed that. Before that, it wasn't even allowed, but post Hibble v. Nevada, which is the SCOTUS case, cops, state legislatures can pass stop and ID laws.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of things in here that you mentioned that I'd like to follow up with you on in an additional recording of the podcast. But just to wrap things up, do you want to give like those 3 rules again that are important?
Basic rules, and these rules are rules that, I have clients who are in prison today because they didn't follow these rules. And I have clients I was able to get out of prison, have friends and family who are not in prison today because they followed the rules. Are 1, don't trust the cops. They can lie to you, they can trick you. 2, don't talk to the cops. If they come up to you and say, sorry, you can't talk right now, try to walk away. If they don't let you walk away, invoke your right to remain silent, ask to see a lawyer. And rule 3 is any sort of search, do not consent to a search.
Well, thanks, Kenneth. Really appreciate taking the time to talk with you about this and get this important information out to our supporters and listeners. And like I said, there's a number of things that you mentioned that I'd love to, talk with you further about. But I'm sure we'll have you back on to talk about not only basic criminal defense kind of stuff or know your rights or know your risks kind of stuff, but also, your day job, which is helping lead the Oregon Innocence Project and how that's going. But thanks for your time. And this has been another episode of Trailblazing Justice. And thanks to Todd Davila for his production.